What happens when institutional competence meets political theater? You get the silent treatment that changed North American power dynamics forever. While America escalated, Canada demonstrated that in the modern world, the side that maintains composure usually wins. I've been analyzing diplomatic strategy and international relations for decades, and I can tell you that Canada's response to American trade aggression represents something extraordinary in modern statecraft. Not because of any dramatic gestures or brilliant tactical maneuvers, but because of something far more sophisticated: the disciplined refusal to let external chaos dictate internal decision-making processes. Canada mastered the art of strategic silence while America abandoned every principle of institutional restraint. The public story, as most people experienced it, was one of escalating trade tensions and dramatic political confrontations. American officials issued threats, imposed tariffs, and demanded immediate responses to ever-changing policy positions. The media covered each escalation as if it were a boxing match, waiting for Canada to throw a counterpunch that would justify the next round of American escalation. But what actually happened was far more consequential than any dramatic retaliation could have been. Canada made a strategic decision that confounded everyone expecting traditional diplomatic responses. They chose not to play by the rules that American officials were trying to impose. Instead of matching escalation with escalation, instead of responding to theater with theater, they maintained institutional discipline, while America demonstrated institutional breakdown. To understand why this approach was so effective, you have to understand the psychology behind escalatory diplomacy. Leaders who rely on chaos and confrontation as negotiating tools depend on getting emotional reactions from their counterparts. When the other side gets angry, defensive, or retaliatory, it validates the aggressive approach and provides justification for further escalation. The strategy only works when both sides participate in the escalation dynamic. Canada refused to participate. When American officials issued ultimatums, Canada responded with measured policy statements. When trade threats were announced via social media, Canada communicated through established diplomatic channels. When American positions changed daily based on political calculations, Canada maintained consistent positions based on institutional analysis. The contrast became impossible to ignore. What made this approach particularly devastating was how it exposed the fundamental weakness of governance by chaos. When one side maintains professional standards and the other side abandons them, the difference becomes a form of soft power that shapes how other countries, international organizations, and global markets perceive the relationship. Canada didn't need to attack American credibility. American behavior was doing that work more effectively than any criticism could have. The economic implications of this strategic patience became visible almost immediately. Markets respond to predictability, and when one country offers consistent policy signals while another offers daily surprises, capital flows toward consistency. Canadian bonds attracted investment not because of superior returns, but because investors could predict what Canadian policy would look like 6 months in advance. American policy, by contrast, became a daily gamble. International corporations making long-term investment decisions began treating Canada as the stable partner and America as the volatile risk factor. This wasn't based on ideological preferences or anti-American sentiment. It was based on practical assessments of which jurisdiction offered the institutional reliability that long-term business planning requires. When reliability becomes a competitive advantage, the country that maintains it gains influence regardless of its size relative to more chaotic partners. Canadian officials understood this dynamic and structured their responses accordingly. Instead of trying to match American political theater, they focused on providing what American politics could no longer deliver: boring competence. Trade disputes were handled through established legal frameworks rather than Twitter announcements. Policy positions were communicated through professional channels rather than cable news appearances. Negotiations followed institutional protocols rather than personal grievances. The contrast became so stark that it started reshaping how other countries approached their own relationships with America. When allies watched Canada maintain dignity and effectiveness while dealing with American chaos, it provided a model for how institutional competence could counter political volatility. Other countries began adopting similar approaches: professional responses to unprofessional provocations, institutional stability in the face of political instability. From America's perspective, this Canadian approach was deeply frustrating because it denied the chaos-driven leadership, the emotional reactions that fuel escalatory politics. When provocations are met with measured responses, when threats are answered with policy analysis, when drama is greeted with institutional procedure, the escalation strategy loses its power. The side trying to create chaos starts looking desperate rather than strong. This dynamic became visible in how American officials began talking about Canada. Initial confidence gave way to irritation, then to frustration, then to the kind of angry rhetoric that signals strategic failure. When you're reduced to complaining that your opponent isn't fighting fair because they won't engage in the dysfunction you're trying to create, you've already lost the battle for credibility. The international community took note. When major allies began treating Canada as a model of how to deal with American unpredictability, it shifted the global perception of who represented stability and who represented chaos in North American relationships. Countries that had traditionally looked to Washington for leadership began consulting Ottawa for examples of institutional competence under pressure. What makes Canada's strategic silence particularly impressive is how it required discipline at every level of government. It's easy to maintain professional standards when dealing with professional counterparts. It's much harder to maintain those standards when dealing with officials who abandon professionalism as a negotiating tactic. Canadian institutions demonstrated that institutional integrity doesn't depend on reciprocity. It depends on internal commitment to standards that transcend external pressure. The trade policy arena provided the clearest example of how this discipline translated into practical advantage. While American trade policy lurched from one position to another based on political messaging needs, Canadian trade policy maintained consistency based on long-term economic analysis. International trading partners began structuring their North American strategies around Canadian predictability rather than American market size, because predictability had become more valuable than access to volatile markets. This shift had profound implications for how global supply chains were organized. Companies that had traditionally routed North American operations through American hubs began using Canadian infrastructure as a gateway to both countries. When one country offers stable regulatory frameworks and the other offers daily policy uncertainty, rational business planning gravitates towards stability even when it means accepting smaller initial markets. The diplomatic dimension of Canada's strategic patience extended far beyond trade issues into broader questions about how democracies maintain legitimacy under authoritarian pressure tactics. By refusing to abandon institutional norms, even when dealing with leaders who had abandoned those norms themselves, Canada demonstrated that democratic governance could maintain effectiveness without surrendering its principles. This example resonated internationally, particularly among democracies dealing with similar pressure from authoritarian neighbors or internal populist movements. Canada showed that institutional competence could be maintained even under extreme external pressure, that professional governance could counter political theater, and that strategic patience could defeat tactical aggression. The psychological impact on American politics was equally significant but less visible. When a neighboring democracy demonstrates superior institutional performance under pressure, it highlights the costs of domestic institutional breakdown. American observers watching Canadian competence couldn't help but notice the contrast with American dysfunction, and that comparison began influencing domestic political expectations. What's particularly striking about this entire episode is how it revealed the relationship between institutional health and international influence. Countries don't maintain global respect through military power or economic size alone. They maintain it through demonstrated competence in handling complex challenges. When competence becomes rare, the countries that maintain it gain influence disproportionate to their traditional power metrics. Canada's silent treatment of American chaos represents more than a successful diplomatic strategy. It represents a preview of how power will be distributed in an increasingly unstable world. Countries that can maintain institutional integrity while others abandon it will attract the partnerships, investments, and alliances that translate into long-term influence. Chaos may generate short-term attention, but competence generates long-term respect. For observers trying to understand how global power dynamics are evolving, Canada's approach offers important lessons about the relationship between internal governance and external influence. When institutions function predictably, other countries want to build relationships around that predictability. When institutions become chaotic, other countries adapt by reducing their dependence on the chaos. The most sobering aspect of this transformation is how it demonstrates that even the most powerful countries can lose influence quickly when they abandon the institutional competence that made them influential in the first place. Power based on reliability is more durable than power based on dominance, but it requires constant cultivation through institutions that maintain standards regardless of external pressure. Canada's strategic silence during the trade conflict will be remembered as the moment when institutional competence proved superior to political theater on the world stage. By refusing to engage in dysfunction, by maintaining professional standards under unprofessional pressure, by choosing strategic patience over tactical retaliation, Canada demonstrated that in the modern world, the side that maintains composure usually wins. And that lesson is already reshaping how countries approach international relationships in an era of increasing instability.